Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all 389 Bach chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gott sei gelobet und gebenedeiet. It's a tongue twister to say. It translates to, O Lord, we praise thee, bless thee, and adore thee. This is definitely a doozy of a chorale. We have two back-to-back, very lengthy chorales, so I hope you are strapped in. Yeah, this is a modal chorale, that's for sure. We have some Mixolydian vibes going on in some of the phrases. But all in all, it's really fascinating. We should just hop right into the analysis. The video is going to be too long otherwise. So, no key signature. We cadence on G major, and we start on G major. So that immediately is a red flag to me. But I think we are in the key of G, but we oscillate between G Mixolydian and G major throughout the piece. So I'll just put mix underneath it in parentheses to remind us of that. But yeah, we're going to start off with a 1 chord, G major, some passing tones in the lower voices, and then we get B, D, G, and G, and we'd be tempted to call that 1/6. However, this F natural here is either a byproduct of the fact that we're in G Mixolydian or a byproduct of the fact that this is a secondary dominant. We can call this 5/6/4 because G is also the dominant of the 4. But if you hear this as 1/6 because you're hearing this whole phrase as Mixolydian, that's totally fine too. I just think it's more than a coincidence, the fact that we get a C major chord after the fact. E, C, E, and G, 4/6. Neighbor tone in the tenor, passing tone in the bass. We then get C, C, E, and A. Sorry, this is 4/6, not 4 in root position. C, C, E, and A. That is a 2 chord in first inversion. We're getting ready for a cadence anyways, which I'll talk about when we get there. Then we have very interesting chord, F natural, B, D, and A. And I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, even though it creates a really interesting sound. F, A, D, and A I think is the chord we're looking for here, which is a 5 chord. And it's minor, of course, because of F natural, not F sharp. And then we cadence on E minor, which is 6. And I immediately heard this as a deceptive cadence because of this. So it's like 5 going to 6, or more specifically 5/6 going to 6, which is kind of like a Phrygian cadence if this were a half cadence. But no, it's not. I hear it as a deceptive cadence because we're cadencing on E minor via this really interesting 5/6 chord. But because this chorale is somewhat modal, I really don't know what to call it. It's a really fascinating cadence. Like I said, I heard it like a deceptive cadence, but I think there's an argument to be made to call it an imperfect authentic, or maybe even a plagal cadence in some sort of E key or E mode, like E Phrygian. But all in all, I heard it like in a deceptive cadence, but I think other analyses are also viable as well. But moving ahead to the next cadence, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, which is interesting because you would expect C major with no key signature, right? But no, this is very much in the key of G, and the fact that there is no key signature is even more interesting because of the fact that there's F sharp's naturally written throughout, but F natural's equally present as well. So we have, here we'll just say that this is our common chord, or yeah, we'll just go ahead and call this next chord our common chord. So we're actually not really modulating, so just imagine the fact that we're switching from a Mixolydian pitch collection to a major pitch collection, I guess. So we have E, E, G, and C. That's another C major triad in first inversion, passing tone in the bass. We then get C, F, G, and D, which is interesting because no F natural yet, or sorry, no F sharp yet. So that would make this a, I don't know, maybe this C is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually 5/6/5 of 4. Yeah, I imagine that's what it is, of 4, because the next beat we get C, E, G, and C, which is our 4 chord. in root position. Neighbor tone in the alto. We then have G, D, G, and B. That is our 1 chord. Our tonic triad. The fact that 4 is going to 1 in root position is also kind of a modal sound as well, because there isn't a diatonic major dominant in the key of, or maybe not the key of, but in Mixolydian. We then have D, D, G, and A, and I reckon that this G is an accent, or a suspension rather, it's a 4-3 suspension over the bass, so this is actually just a 5 chord, with a delayed 7th going on here, and we ultimately cadence on 1. Bach does this sort of prolonged 5 chord as a cadential figure pretty commonly. So let's move ahead to the next phrase. So the next phrase is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, which is what we would expect with no key signature, but this is definitely more so a piece in the key of G rather than in the key of C. In fact, I think this is the only cadence we have in the key of C, but let me double check. No, we actually get one more cadence in the key of C before we cadence in G at the end of the piece. But all in all, we'll call this our pivot chord. We'll say that this G chord in the key of C is now our 5, and we have F natural again. So D, D, F, and A. We could call that 2, or we could call it 7-6, and we could say that this A is an accented non-chord tone, and we could say B, D, D, and F is our chord, and that'll be more consistent with our analysis, actually, because we've expected... actually, is that right in this case? Maybe not. I think we are going to call it 2. Wait, why would we call it 2? There's an F in the chord. Goodness, I'm so sorry. D, D, F, and A. Yeah, that would be our 2 chord, of course. Of course, 2 has an F in it. My bad. Sorry about that. But you might hear this as 7-6, and the reason why I'm hesitant to call this 7-6 is because it's not going to a 1 chord. It's going to A, F, and C, or A, E, and C, depending on how you hear it. You could hear this as 4-6. You could hear this as 6. Both of them are, I think, valid analyses depending on where the chord happens. And then we have B, D, D, and G with a passing 7th in the soprano. That is a tonic that is a 5 chord. Now, because we're in the key of C major, in first inversion, so 5-6. And then we have C, G, C, and E. There's our tonic triad right there with a passing 7th in the bass. Before we get A, F, B, and F, or A, F, C, and F. You might hear this as 4-6. You might hear this also as B, A, F, and F as 7-4-2 maybe, because depending on how you hear it. But I'll offer that analysis. I think it's more 4-6 because it's bridging, or it's going to another 1 chord, and 4-6 is more commonly, it's more common to go to 1 via a 4-6. And notice how he includes the 7th in between the 4-6 going to 1 as well. But here we have G, G, C, and E, which is a 1 chord in second inversion actually, which is interesting, but it's part of a passing figure, so that's okay. Then we have F, A, C, and D. We're preparing for a perfect authentic cadence, so it's common for us to see a 2-6-5 chord. That's D minor 7 over F. A little passing tone there in the alto. And then we have D, G, D, D, G, B, and D. That is our 5 chord with a passing 7th in the tenor. And then we cadence on 1 with this really low C in the bass. Okay, that's super interesting so far. Trying to make sense of all of the modal changes as well, having to sort of code switch between modal language and tonal language to figure out this chorale. But we're trucking along. All right, next cadence is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So this C chord we get right here, which I'll reanalyze, even though we get one at the end of last phrase, just because we're on a new system, so the analysis, we're reminded instead of having to scan back. We'll call this now a 4 chord in the key of G major. We then have B, G, D, and G. That is a tonic triad in first inversion. Neighbor tone in the alto. Passing tones in the lower voices. Let's see if that spells anything. We have G, C, A, and A. Not really. Doesn't really spell anything meaningful. We then have G, B, D, and G with an F natural. So I'm going to call this, instead of 1, I'm going to call it 5 of 4. Which is interesting because we have the same thing of a tonic triad turning into a secondary dominant at the beginning of the phrase again, which is cool. And it goes where we expect it to. It goes to C, 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 E, and A, actually. So the chord is very similar, but we get a deceptive progression. Instead, we get 2, 6 rather than 4. And I think that that's a totally acceptable progression because 2 and 4 share 2 of their 3 notes in common. We then have D, F sharp, D, and A. And even though it's happening on the weaker part of the measure, we do have a passing 5 chord, which is meaningful because we're getting ready for a cadence. And the harmonic rhythm is definitely sped up because of all of the activity in the inner voices. But here we have E, G, B, and A. And I think all of these are accented non-chord tones, actually. And our chord of interest is on 4 and. We have E, A, C sharp, and G, which is actually A7 over E, which is 5, 4, 3 of 5, because A is the dominant of D, which is our dominant. And sure enough, on the next beat, we get D, B, D, and F sharp. We get another kind of an interesting analysis here because of the fact that, I messed up again. That's just a suspension over the bass. This is just a 6-5 suspension over the bass, more specifically. This is just a 5 chord that resolves on the next, partially resolves on the next beat. We get another suspension in the alto that interrupts it, but nevertheless, the full 5 chord, and even with a passing 7th going on as well, or a neighboring 7th, happens on beat 2 and before we cadence on 1. All of this is just suspending or ornamenting the 5, making sure I get all of the non-chord tones here as well. Okay, moving ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence again in the key of G major. So let's keep going along. So we have another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze, passing 7th in the bass, and here we have E, C sharp, E, and G. That is C sharp diminished over E, which is 7, 6 of 5, because C sharp is our dominant C sharp is our leading tone in the key of D, and D is our dominant. And then we have D, D, F sharp, and A, which spells D major, which is where our secondary leading tone chord wants to go. So sorry for the interruption as well. I had to get a new pencil. My other one ran out of lead. And then we have B, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, 1, 6. And we are starting to move in towards the cadence, so we're looking for cadential chords. We have A, C, G, and C. This G is a 4-3 suspension, a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and this is really just F sharp diminished over A, which is 7-6. We then have B, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad in first inversion again, that turns into root position on the end of the same beat. I'm looking for F naturals here, but we don't have any because we go to a C major chord afterwards. Oh no, apologies, we don't go to a C major chord. We go to C, E, G, and A, which is our 2-6-5 chord. As we're getting ready for the cadence, Bach loves his 2-6-5 chords. Then we have chord tone, and then F sharp gets introduced here, which is a non-chord tone. D, A, F sharp, and A. Little passing seventh there. That's just a D major triad in root position before we cadence on 1. Alright, next cadence, very interesting. We have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. So Bach is going to D minor, which is a nearby key if we're looking at the fact that we have no key signature, but it's a more distant key if we're thinking we're in the key of G major. So it's a very sudden jump, and you hear that jump right here. I had to listen to the chorale several times to hear this descending line, F sharp, F natural, E. It's a very jarring sound, but we'll get to it when we get there. Alright, so we have G, D, G, and B. Just a tonic triad again, no need to reanalyze. Actually, we do need to reanalyze. This is an F natural, and F natural means that this is going to be a dominant, so 5 of 4, and that goes to E, E, G, and C. Yeah, it's no coincidence. That's definitely how Bach is making sense of this modal harmony, but yeah, or modal melody. We have 4, 6, yeah, C major over E. We then have B, D, G, and D. That is G major over B, tonic triad in first inversion, passing tone in the tenor. We then have B, B, G, and D again, so no need to reanalyze. I guess we could technically say that this E right here, which is kind of outlining a cycle, right? Up a fourth, down a fifth, up a fourth, and goes down a fifth again. We could say that this E, B, G, and D is kind of like a passing 6, 7 chord before we go to A, C, G, and D, which is this G is our accented non-chord tone. This is actually a D7 chord over A, which is 5, 4, 3. Notice how whenever we see 5 chords in second inversion, or not always, but most of the time, when they're not part of a passing figure, he always adds the 7 in there to turn it into a 5, 4, 3. That's because of the fact that second inversion triads really do operate mostly like how you find them in the textbook, which is really interesting. Definitely the most consistent thing from the textbook that I find in Bach's harmony, interestingly enough. Afterwards, we have a very interesting progression. We have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord just in root position, so we could just turn that into a 5-3. But here are those interesting passing tones that we were talking about. We have F natural and C natural, which would turn this into a passing 5-7 chord. And I think this is just a direct modulation to the key of D minor. We have like a passing, what would you even call it? I guess it would technically be like a 1-7 chord because it's not dominant. But yeah, there's the D in the bass, the A in the melody, and then passing fourth between the inner voices, which is really interesting because we typically don't see like 1-7 chords in such a focal fashion. Actually, it makes sense that this is a passing 7 chord because of the fact that, well, it's passing. We usually don't see tonic 7 chords on a strong numerical beat. We see them as a byproduct of a passing 7th, which I point out all the time. But the fact that he's modulating via a tonic 7th chord is actually really interesting. And we definitely are getting ready for a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. So the fact that he goes directly from D major to D minor is unusual, but very interesting. We then have G, B flat, E, and G. That's E diminished over G, which is 2-6. Sorry, triads can't be half diminished, so I'll just make that a full degree symbol. Anticipating 7th in the bass. We then have A, D, and E. This D being an accented non-chord tone. That's just A major, which is our dominant 5 in root position. Delayed passing tone in the tenor. And then we have a perfect authentic cadence on 1. Alright, fantastic. So we then have, on the next phrase, a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major again. So the fact that we go from D minor back to G major, super interesting. So we're going to kick things off with a C major triad. I think this is our pivot chord, interestingly enough. This would be a 7 chord in the key of D minor, but in the key of G major, this would be our 4 chord in root position, passing tone in the bass. And then we have A, C, and F sharp. And the reason why I think this is our passing or our pivot chord is because 4 wants to go to F sharp diminished, our 7-6 chord, right? And then, of course, that goes to G major, B, G, D, and G. That's our tonic triad and root position. Actually, goodness, how could I let that slip? You would be tempted to call this a 1 chord, but we have an F natural in the melody. We have F sharp and then F natural, right, within a beat of one another. This isn't 1-6. This is 5-6 of 4, which is super interesting. The fact that we have F natural and F sharp in such close proximity to one another. 4, 7, 6 to not 1, but if you're hearing this in Mixolydian, you could call it 1. 5, 6 of 4 instead. And that goes to 5, 6 of 4, C, G, C, and E. Or sorry, no, that goes to 4, not 5, 6 of 4 again. And then we have a passing 7th in the bass. Notice how that 7th, oh sorry, never mind. I was about to make a comment about 4 going to 1, but it's not going to 1. It's going back to A, C, and F sharp, which is our diminished triad, our 7 chord in first inversion again. Get a 7th there and another chord tone in the alto. We then have D, B, D, and F sharp. Again, I think this D is a accented non-chord tone, or sorry, a suspension over the bass. That's a 6-5 suspension, which we've seen before. So this is just 5, and then we cadence on 1. So the fact that we get 7, 6, 5, 1, that's an interesting perfect authentic cadence. But really, what matters for the perfect authentic cadence is 5 going to 1. Even though we generally associate perfect authentic cadences with a chord like 4, or with a chord like 1, 6, 4, or a chord like 2, something that precedes the dominant as well. But it's really just the 5 going to 1 that makes it perfect authentic, or sorry, it makes it authentic. What makes it perfect authentic is the fact that we have the G and the tonic rather in the melody. So next we have a perfect authentic cadence again. Loads of perfect authentic cadences in this chorale. Basically, all of our cadences except for the first cadence are all going to be perfect authentic cadences. But we're going back to the key of C major. So as far as our departure point is concerned, I think we're heading right into the key of C major. We can call this G major triad in root position. Here our 5 chord, passing tone in the melody. We then get A, C, A, and F. That is a F major triad in first inversion, right? That's 4, 6. Some passing tones in the lower voices, B, D, A, and F. Notice how 4, 6 before going to 1, which is our C major triad on the next beat, we get a passing 7 chord in between them. So 4 going to 7 going to 1. That's a very common pattern that Bach uses. And then it looks like we have a bunch of activity here, which we do, but he really just rotates the voices, so the chord turns into 6 on this beat. And then instead of going to 6-4, we go to G, G, B, and D, which is our 5 chord, our dominant G major in root position, passing 7th in the bass. We then have E, G, C, and E, our tonic triad in first inversion, turns into root position on the and of 1. We then get G, G, C, and D, another 4-3 suspension over the bass, but this is really just implying a big 5 chord, delayed 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on 1. Another perfect authentic cadence. Alright, we're in the home stretch. Perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, again, to end this chorale that has no key signature, which we would expect to end in C major, but this is a modally derived chorale, so it's cool. I think this is a kind of a direct modulation to G, just because we get this pause here, and then we get G right afterwards. G in first inversion, what someone would be tempted to call 1, which I was just tempted right there. Notice how we have F natural here rather than F sharp. This is not 1, this is 5, 6 of 4. But if you're hearing this in the key of like Mixolydian, we can call this 1/6 as well. We then have C, E, C, and G. It goes to a 4 chord. We then have B, D, G, and G. That is our tonic triad and first inversion with a passing tone in the tenor. We then have A, F natural, C, and A, which would be it'd be interesting what we would call this. This would be technically an F major chord. It would technically be an F major chord, right? Yeah, so we could call this 7, right, which would be indicative of the fact that we are in Mixolydian. Or we could call it B, F, D, and A, which would be more sensible, actually, now that I think about it. We have, if we call, not those passing tones, but if we call these passing tones, or accented non-chord tones, rather, we could call this 7, half diminished of 4. And it does go to C major, right? C, C, E, and A, but we get the G delayed here. That's kind of interesting. I don't know what to call this. We could call this 2, or with this B right here, what would we call that? B, G, C, and E. I would say that this is just a passing 7th, and that really this is a 4 chord in root position with this A suspended over the C, which is like a 6/5 suspension. Yeah, I think that that's what makes the most sense. Then we get D, A, D, and F sharp. That's a 5 chord. Get some suspension action going on in the tenor. A little bit more activity in the melody as well. And this should be a half note. For some reason it didn't get parsed as a half note in my engraving software. And then we cadence on 1. And that's the chorale for today. All in all, relatively difficult chorale to analyze. I'd say the modality definitely spiced it up a bit. This first cadence I'm still not 100% sure on. I'm pretty confident with my analysis, but then again, I'm not 100%. I know that people have devoted their whole academic careers to looking at the modal music of Bach, and there's lots of research and scholarship out there, so maybe that's worth diving into before I analyze any more modal chorales. But I'm using my own analytical sensibilities to make sense of the chorales, and I think I'm doing a pretty good job. But that being said, definitely a very difficult chorale to analyze today. I'm hoping that the chorales shorten a little bit in the future, so I don't have to spend as much time really diving deep into them. But they're still really fascinating, and I appreciate the experience. That being said, thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much for continuing to watch the channel. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.